Bed. Sometimes the most devastating announcements don't arrive with raised voices or flashing banners. They arrive quietly, almost politely. They sound like housekeeping, like a clarification. And by the time you realize what's actually being said, the meaning has already settled in your chest. But before we continue, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for updates 1 minute ago. That's how this moment is being framed. Not as history, not as a retrospective, but as something unfolding now in real time while the rest of the world is still catching up. King Charles has confirmed Prince Harry's future. And what makes this confirmation so unsettling isn't that it's dramatic, it's that it isn't. No anger. No accusations, no emotional language, just a calm, measured acknowledgement that leaves very little room to breathe. Prince Harry's role within the working royal family is officially over. Permanent. Not paused. Not suspended. Not under review. Over. For years, the public has been trained to expect reversals, reconciliations, carefully staged olive branches. We've been told, again and again, that nothing in this family is ever truly final. That time heals. That blood matters, that doors remain open, even if only slightly. But listen carefully to what was said this time, and maybe more importantly, to what wasn't. This didn't sound like a door left ajar. It sounded like a door quietly locked, the key turned once and placed somewhere it would never be reached again. And that raises a question that's uncomfortable to ask, but impossible to ignore. Why now? Why confirm this at this moment, with this tone, and with this level of finality? Because this wasn't just an update. It was a signal to the institution, a signal to the public, and perhaps, most painfully, a signal to one person who has spent years living in the space between still family and no longer needed. Prince Harry has existed in that in-between for a long time, long enough that many people stopped noticing how unusual it was. He wasn't fully out, but he was never really in. He was mentioned, but not involved, a presence without a position. A name without a function, and that ambiguity became a kind of oxygen for speculation. Every holiday appearance sparked hope. Every headline about talks reignited theories. Every carefully worded statement was dissected for clues that a return might still be possible. The public filled in the blanks with optimism, or outrage. And now, or sympathy, sometimes all three at once. But the palace never did. The palace instead stayed quiet. Almost unnervingly so. And now, suddenly, that silence has been replaced with something far more decisive. Confirmation, not explanation, not justification, just confirmation. That alone should tell you something. Because when institutions like this explain themselves, it usually means they're unsure. When they justify, it means they're defensive, but when they confirm, calmly and without elaboration, it means the decision has already survived every internal argument. It means the debates are over. This story matters right now because it marks the end of uncertainty. And uncertainty, paradoxically, was the last thing holding hope together. As long as nothing was said outright, people could believe anything. They could imagine reconciliation happening quietly. They could assume talks were ongoing. They could convince themselves that distance was temporary, that time would soften edges. But permanence changes the emotional equation entirely. Permanence doesn't ask you to wait. It doesn't ask you to hope. Dast. And acceptance is harder than anger. Think about how long the narrative around Prince Harry has been framed as unfinished. A chapter still being written, a story without a conclusion. Critics often spoke in terms of what happens next, not what has ended. This announcement rewrites that framing. It tells us that the ending may have already happened, and we were just late to hear about it. And here's where the discomfort deepens. Because this wasn't framed as a punishment. There was no mention of wrongdoing, no public scolding, no list of grievances aired for the world to judge. Instead, it was framed as a matter of role, of function, of structure. That distinction is crucial. In the monarchy, roles are everything. They determine access, visibility, relevance, positive, endowed fashion. And once a role is removed, what remains isn't just personal separation, it's institutional distance. This confirmation didn't say Prince Harry isn't loved. It didn't say he isn't family, but it did say he is no longer part of the working core. And in this system, that line matters more than almost any other. Ask yourself something honestly. And I mean honestly. When was the last time the palace spoke about Prince Harry's future with this kind of certainty? Not speculation from commentators. Psychologists, not anonymous sources, not interpretive headlines, an official acknowledgement, clear enough that it couldn't be softened later. Direct enough that it couldn't be walked back. If you're struggling to remember one, that's because there hasn't been one. Until now? Which brings us back to that question again. Why now? What changed? Because institutions don't make permanent declarations unless something forces their hand. Either pressure builds to a breaking point or patience quietly runs out. And patience, in royal terms, looks very different than it does in ordinary families. Patience doesn't look like arguments or ultimatums. It looks like delays. It looks like silence. It looks like giving someone just enough space to show you who they're going to be. And then, one day, deciding that nothing more needs to be learned, there's a subtle cruelty in that kind of finality. Not because it's harsh, but because it's so controlled. No public drama, no emotional catharsis. Just a line drawn neatly and without flourish. For those who still believed reconciliation was inevitable, this confirmation lands like a quiet shock. The kind that doesn't hit all at once, the kind that settles slowly, forcing you to revisit every past moment and wonder if you misread it. Was that meeting really meaningful? Was that silence really strategic? Was that gesture ever an invitation or just politeness? And here's another uncomfortable truth. The monarchy doesn't operate on hope. It operates on stability. Ambiguity can be tolerated for a while, but only if it serves a purpose. Eventually, ambiguity becomes a liability. It invites speculation. It weakens structure. It blurs lines that the institution depends on being clear. This announcement feels like the moment ambiguity became unacceptable, which suggests something else entirely. That behind the scenes, the question was no longer, will Harry return? The question had already shifted to, how long do we allow this uncertainty to continue? And when that question gets asked, the outcome is rarely favorable to the one standing outside. This isn't just about Prince Harry. Not really. It's about what happens when personal history collides with institutional survival. When family bonds are weighed against public clarity, when the cost of leaving a door open becomes greater than the cost of closing it, and that's why this confirmation feels heavier than previous developments. Because it doesn't invite debate, it ends it. Still, there's something else that makes this moment linger. The tone. There was no warmth in it, but there was no hostility either. It felt resolved. As if the emotional processing had already happened elsewhere. Privately, long before the rest of us were brought into the room. And that raises a chilling possibility. What if this announcement wasn't the moment things ended? What if it was simply the moment the ending was acknowledged? Because endings, especially in families like this, rarely happen all at once. They happen in increments, in missed calls, in conversations that never quite get finished, in expectations quietly lowered until one day there's nothing left to adjust. By the time someone says, it's over, it usually has been for a while, which means that what we're reacting to now may not be the decision itself, but the decision to stop pretending the decision hadn't already been made. And that's where this story truly begins. Because once permanence is acknowledged publicly, it changes everything else.
It reframes the past. It reshapes future narratives.
It alters how every silence, every absence, every omission will now be interpreted. From this point on, nothing is provisional. And yet, there's still something missing from this picture. Something unresolved. The announcement tells us what has been decided, but it doesn't tell us why this decision could no longer be avoided. It doesn't tell us what finally tipped the balance. It doesn't tell us when patience turned into conclusion. And it certainly doesn't tell us what happened behind closed doors before the words were ever released. Those answers weren't offered. They were withheld, and that withholding may be the most revealing detail of all. But because the palace doesn't withhold information without reason, and whatever that reason is, it didn't start today. It started earlier, much earlier. And when we look closely at the language, the timing, and the silence surrounding this confirmation, a far more complicated story begins to emerge. One that suggests this wasn't a sudden decision at all, but the final sentence in a conversation that had already ended. But before we can understand how the door closed, we need to understand the sentence that locked it. Because buried in that calm confirmation was a line that changed everything. Was this confirmation or a farewell? That question keeps circling back, no matter how many times you read the announcement, no matter how carefully you parse the words. Because on the surface, it doesn't sound dramatic. It doesn't sound cruel. It doesn't even sound emotional. But the more you sit with it, the more unsettling it becomes. There is a sentence in this announcement that changes everything, not because of what it says loudly, but because of what it closes quietly. Royal statements are engineered documents. Every comma is intentional. Every omission is negotiated. Every phrase survives layers of legal review, political consideration, and institutional memory. These are not texts written in a rush. They are written to last. And that's why this one feels different. When King Charles confirmed Prince Harry's future, he didn't frame it as a response to events. He didn't frame it as a reaction. He framed it as a settled fact. Something already understood internally, now simply acknowledged externally. That distinction matters more than most people realize. Because when an institution like the monarchy reacts, it leaves itself room to adjust. But when it acknowledges, it's signaling that adjustment is no longer on the table. Read it again, slowly. Not as a headline, not as breaking news, but as language. There is no conditional phrasing. No, at this time. No ongoing discussions. No path forward. No possibility of future engagement. Instead, there is clarity. Clean, cold, final. Prince Harry's role within the working royal family is officially over. That's the sentence. That's the one everything pivots on. And here's the thing most people miss at first glance. It doesn't say Prince Harry has chosen to leave. It doesn't say he is stepping back. It doesn't say he has been removed. It says the role is over, as if the role itself expired, as if it reached the end of its usefulness, as if the position no longer exists, at least not for him. Back. That passive construction does something very specific. It removes emotion. It removes blame. It removes the possibility of argument. You can debate a decision. You can challenge a punishment. You can negotiate a disagreement. But how do you argue with something that is simply over? This is how institutions end things without appearing to end them. And it forces us to ask an uncomfortable question. Who was this sentence really written for? Because if it were written for the public, it would explain more. If it were written for critics, it would justify itself. If it were written for Harry, it might sound different. Instead, it reads like a message to the system itself. A line drawn so future decisions can move forward without hesitation. Almost like clearing the board. There's a long history of royal exits that were handled very differently. Even when relationships were strained, language was often softened. Doors were left symbolically open. Futures were described as evolving. This time, there's no evolution. There's resolution. And resolution suggests exhaustion. Think about what it takes for a monarchy, an institution built on continuity and tradition, to publicly acknowledge permanence. This isn't a modern corporation announcing a restructure. This is a centuries-old system that thrives on the illusion that nothing truly changes. When that system admits something has ended, it's because pretending otherwise has become more destabilizing than the truth. So what pressure built to this point? Because make no mistake, this sentence didn't appear overnight. It didn't emerge from a sudden emotional impulse. It was refined, discussed, revised, likely delayed, which means there was a moment, or several, when this sentence could have been softer, and it wasn't. That choice tells us more than the sentence itself. There's another subtle detail buried in the wording that deserves attention. The phrase working royal family. That term does heavy lifting here. It's not just descriptive, it's classificatory. The monarchy isn't just a family. It's an institution with tiers, inner circles, defined roles. The phrase working royal separates symbolic presence from functional power. You can be family and still be outside the core. You can be visible and still be irrelevant. You can be spoken about and still be excluded. By anchoring the sentence to working status, the announcement makes clear that this isn't about blood, it's about function, and function is where the real authority lives. This is why the sentence lands so hard for those who understand how the monarchy operates. Because losing a role within the working structure isn't just about duties, and then it's about access, it's about influence. It's about who gets consulted and who doesn't. Once you are outside the working core, decisions happen without you. And that's where permanence becomes something else entirely. Ask yourself this. If the door were truly still open, why close it with this sentence? Why not leave things ambiguous as they've done for years? Why choose clarity now when ambiguity had served them so well? The answer may be simpler than it's comfortable to accept. Because ambiguity stopped serving a purpose. For a long time, not saying anything allowed everyone to project their own version of reality. Supporters could believe reconciliation was coming. Critics could believe distance was deserved. The palace could avoid confrontation. But ambiguity also creates instability. It invites constant reinterpretation. It forces the institution to manage reactions instead of outcomes. Eventually that becomes a liability. This sentence eliminates that liability.